Hey everybody, it's Ian. Welcome back to Introduction to Folklore, and today we're talking about digital folklore, digital folk groups, digital life lived online and the aesthetics of it. And it sort of has a circuitous history, because obviously it's something that has only been an object of study for the past 20 years or so. I think there's initial studies of Newsnet groups that go back to like the late 80s or so. The first time people started observing that there was something happening in this form of communication that didn't have a particular precedent, yet nevertheless was something that a folklorist could recognize as artistic communication in small groups. And like all seismic moments, it was something that we just didn't know exactly what to do with for a while. So let's get what's going on. In part because even though by that time the discipline had emerged to the point where we recognize that it is not simply the old stuff, that doesn't necessarily mean that we were automatically, immediately capable of having a stake and having a stance on how to interpret new stuff when it emerged. But I mean, the discipline is often just catching up to what the folk are doing at any given moment, and that's the nature of the beast. So, because folklore has this long history. I mean, it might be strange to talk about digital folklore by like starting in the 17th century, but it's good to sort of think about the disciplinary questions that inform and therefore potentially occlude what we actually study. And so, for a long time, we were obsessed with things. Basically, it was these 19th century, 18th, 19th century people who saw these things that existed within a particular population, and they were understood as remnants from a past, and we need to reclaim these things, these texts. We need to reconstruct these texts. And we can do it through archival sources. We can do it, if we have to, through observing and collecting from the people themselves. But we have this disdain for the people at the same time. And once we have notions of variation thrown in there, we kind of think of variation as some kind of the introduction of mistakes over time. The aspect is the typical metaphor is the game of telephone. It's like, someone screwed it up, and now this is all we have left for us. And that's not a particularly healthy way of looking at it. And then, so we were still sort of more or less kind of obsessed with stuff, because it was always infused with this idea that the older was the better, the older was the more authentic, the older told us something about the past and therefore about the present, and how to, certainly when we're looking at it through the lens of romantic nationalism, where we're trying to establish the deep roots of these emergent groupings, where we're trying to sort of establish what a people are like, and that no, we have a long history in this soil, no less. And so the older we can establish, the better it is for us. And again, this idea of the most authentic. And that is still a remnant that exists. Not really among folklorists. We're still historically interested in what is the origins of something, because that's an interesting and important question, but it's not the question that therefore precludes ways that we address the contemporary. But we're always looking for you're always coming across these sort of articles like, what's the original version of a fairy tale, or what's the original version of a particular custom, what are its origins, and as if anything that isn't exactly imitative of that is somehow now an inauthentic, derivative devolution of that custom, or of that practice, or of that text, or whatever. So there's this obsession with things. And then slowly over time, we started shifting towards not simply a study of things, but a study of the group. So first of all, we started looking at how groups, when an item perhaps entered into a group and it had different histories, and different particular contexts, the item changed. And basically, we were looking at ways to explain this devolution. So we were coming up with this model about how things got altered contextually, not necessarily by virtue of a mistake, but still when our efforts were aimed at reconstructing the original, we're like, oh, well, they changed it because of this. Therefore, that is the mechanic that we use to sort of undo that mistake as we imaginatively reconstruct the original to the best of our ability. And then we also started looking at groups as sort of systems. So we don't look at the individual item exclusively. Rather, we are looking at how that item fits into alongside other items and how that sort of starts to initiate change. And then the group really lets you, once you start getting that prospect, then you're understanding that understanding the group makes you understand the item better, at which point you have the benefit of starting to consider changes as a positive thing, that changes becomes a certain amount of deliberateness. You start taking the group seriously as a creative factor, not simply a remnant of the past. And so you have this relationship between the item and the group, and you can actually sort of dovetail it in one of two ways. You can, if you see an item, you try and look for the group in which it's in circulation. And if you think of a group, you try and look for the items that that group circulates. So that there are these both ands, and that's when you start paying attention to performance. That's when you start paying attention to the idea that these items change because they are they need to change in order to fit the aesthetics of the group. And then all of a sudden, change becomes a positive. Change becomes, at the very least, a creative act and not a destructive act. That the change becomes something about making that item new and ongoingly relevant. And that also allows for, once you have that idea of newness, and that things exist at these particular moments, and then you can sort of shrink them down even more. It's like, even within one person's particular performance history or one person's particular repertoire, you can see changes that go from iteration to iteration, and you recognize that, oh, this is not simply the group in an abstract concept. These are individual people within that group who are making honest, good faith sense of continuity with the past, respect for the item, yet nevertheless making adaptations to it in order to meet the immediate contexts of the time. How micro changes in the audience can allow for changes in the item, and that basically the audience and the teller or the performer or whatever collaboratively reconstruct the item ongoingly. So items sort of cease to kind of be a thing. And then, but once we've established that you can sort of find these items, you can recognize something, it's like that appears to me in my first initial investigation, or as it passes my transom, it seems to me to be something akin to a piece of folk culture. Then we start searching for the group. We find these groups that aren't defined by these established categories of things like ethnicity and nationality, but start to be defined by things like occupation and interest, like, you know, fan culture, early fan cultures, like, you know, of professional sports, for example, or, you know, occupations that don't have a precedent like farming or sailing, but like being a cowboy, or being, you know, working the lines, or dam building, or so on. You know, contemporary professions that nevertheless develop their own folk cultures, and that just shifts to the idea that, you know, this process that we had thought about folklore is not the exclusive domain of particular groups of people, but rather we are all engaged in it in some capacity or another, up to and including cis white male middle class dolts like myself. And, you know, remembering that there's a long history of thinking of that privileged as unmarked culture and everything, and like, which basically means default culture. It's the culture that doesn't require adjectives to describe it. Like, there's culture, and then there's women's culture, or there's First Nations culture, or there's African American culture, or whatever. But you know, the culture that doesn't need that adjective is the default culture, and that's that non-reflective, non-critical aspect of both the discipline and also the contemporary political sphere that we are hopefully beginning to unpack as recognizing, oh, that's just, the benefits and the consequences of privilege. We also began to realize that different media, allowed for different forms of communication. And that, our model of this face-to-face didn't necessarily need to be consistent. We recognized that groups could communicate through media like the telephone, or they could produce small textual objects, and that they functioned in the same way. We weren't talking about real-time performance, but we were talking about using media in a way to still do that interrelationship between the things that are transmitted within that group and the sense of groupness. That basically the folk understood media because they live in a mediated world, and it's one of those revelations that once you say it out loud is simultaneously condescending, as if it's like, oh, we have granted you the idea that you are media literate. But when you're stuck in this notion of the old as sort of the default authentic forms of behavior, and the repetitions of same, then it does take a little while for you to, oh wait, they are doing this thing that we always say that they are doing, in terms of it's not simply the old, but the contemporary. They're using different things to do it. They're using telephones, they're using Xeroxes, they are using small local presses. If you have access to a recording studio and you have access to community radio, you're using those sorts of things. And so we can't absolutize folk culture, and then anything that sort of smacks of modernity is outside of it. The folk are always contemporary to their time, and they use whatever is at their disposal in order to create and find meaning. Sometimes they limit themselves, but that limitation is intentional and specific in meeting their expectations. But those are choices that they make, not necessary conditions. They're only necessary conditions in as much as that is how the group understands those conditions to be necessary. Have I talked enough around that? Cool. But there's always this notion that as they were using media, as they were using technology in this intelligent way, simultaneously they existed somehow in real life as well. That they met face to face, and that media was an extension of their face to face. It was what they would engage in when they couldn't be together, as it were. That's basically the idea. And then the digital revolution came, and you started having groups like, as I said, that these old Usenet groups and fan cultures that started to, from fan cultures, Usenet groups were, back when the internet was almost exclusively relegated to university servers, and home internet was a rarity. You had this network that people would start to generate alt.fan. Soap opera clubs, and they would be these purely text-driven fan boards that, because they were limited to certain institutions and certain aspects of privileged access, they might have represented only a narrow band of the North American sphere, yet they were communicating in ways that were clearly folkloric, but they weren't present to each other. It wasn't an extension of like a fan club that met regularly at some dude's house. They only existed. The individuals that comprised this group only existed through the access to this. And that's when you start having this interesting discussion of digital culture, and the cultures that, first of all, the groupness of it doesn't meet our expectations of our small group idea, because our small group, the artistic communications in small group, are Dan Benamou's definitions of folklore, they still just kind of represent co-location, that they are present to each other. And that, but if a group that's never present to each other, and it only expresses itself through word, through then image, through the limitations and the possibilities of the internet medium itself, that starts to change how we operate. So it took a while. And basically it was like, this group functions kind of like, but we would really only pay attention to what was at least a form. We grasped it. We grasped, okay, these groups don't actually get together and meet in real life. They only exist online. Cool. But, one thing, it actually hammered home that Dundesian idea, the definition of group that he brought to folklore, in terms of two or more people who share at least one common factor, and that the common factor that they share doesn't have that additional expectation of a raft of subsequent logical additional common factors, like being present in the same place. If you're talking about people who are, let's just say, a fan group, if it's like prior to internet communication, two people who are fans of, I don't know, Clark Gable. Their Clark Gable fandomness might only really be able to be a topic of conversation when they live in the same town. And when they live in the same town, there is not necessarily, but quite often, the expectation of shared language, perhaps shared ethnic makeup, shared participation in other groups like religious affiliation, occupational affiliation, certainly a shared local history in terms of that's where the good corner store is and that's the bad part of town, and all those sort of subsequent things that are units of worldview that are coterminous. When you're talking about an online group, they might only have that point of consideration. And you probably know this already because you are, for the most part, what they call digital natives, people who have never really lived in a world that wasn't facilitated in some way by internet culture, at least by computer culture and largely by internet culture. One of the things that got sort of thrown up is this issue of, well, do we still think of these things as performance? Our idea of performance is typically when the audience and the performer are if not present to each other, we can sort of momentarily take a pause and say, okay, well, we can imagine that we don't need exactly co-presence to each other, at least in terms of physical form. But if they can be, present to each other through a medium, sure. But what if it's this sort of asynchronous form? What if it is just merely like the back and forth of a text chat, or the back and forth of so the turn-taking nature of internet communication, particularly in these early forms, even before, and even with social media. Social media, whether you're talking very basic stuff like instant messaging, or you're talking about Twitter or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or so on, and which are more post-generated than they are necessarily conversational based. It's really only with things like FaceTime, which is typically two people, and then Skype, which is, and now Zoom, where you start to have this movement of sort of live online communication. Otherwise, it is exchange. It's a turn-taking aspect where it's not quite the same thing, and that not quite the same thing is as sort of live performance. It's not quite the same thing where there are hundreds and hundreds of cues by which the individual who is performing can sort of get feedback from the audience and adjust the performance, and that it isn't that sort of Bakhtinian dialogic in terms of like everyone is present to each other and everyone is fundamentally multiple voices out of which you can discern a pattern, but that pattern is a dual creation. It's turn taking, and it's sort of complicated. But nevertheless, we can now reimagine our ideas of performance and see what's happening there, and we start to consider such things as, well, it's still a communication that has a limited audience, and the expectation that it is being formed to an audience. It is being shaped somehow with some kind of expectations that it'll be met with. It'll be met and interpreted in the manner that is akin to how the sender sent it, or the poster posted it, or whatever, and that there will be some kind of response that recognizes that effort, whether positively or negatively in terms of feedback, but recognizes that there is an exchange going on. So it is performative in that way. More to the point, what happens when we have forms that don't have a precedent? It's one thing, a precedent in sort of, again, real life folk groups, in-person folk groups. It's one thing to look at people who are making songs and making song parodies. It's one thing to look at people who are telling jokes. It's one thing to, again, think of, even if the group isn't an extension of a real world group that just happened to be using the internet as one form of communication, but like their home group is face to face, but rather it is, it's a group that exists only online. Sure, we're grasping that, but what about the things that they are sharing in this group are precedented forms. And so, again, jokes and songs and parodies and all that sort of thing, things that we have a grasp on. What about a wholly new thing? What about shitposts? What about memes? What about these forms that don't have an analog and don't have a precedent in the real world? Not to mention the fact that as technology increases, the kind of productions that take place online are, at least in terms of quality, in some ways virtually indistinguishable from what can be produced by mass culture, what can be produced by popular culture and the culture industries. So you can make fan films that are virtually identical to real world, mass-produced popular culture films. You can make images and do photoshops and so on that are of the same level of quality as the photoshops that you might see in the popular press. Not to mention the fact that people who work in the popular press also exist online, so they might be producing that in the same way, in a way that isn't dissimilar from how, when we look at folk art, a strange aside, when we look at folk art, when we look at carving and certain forms like welding and the building of metal statues and whittling and certain forms of material culture, the people who are producing those are often have that skill set as part of their occupation. So like the welding of statues in a way that is artistic and just for the sake of some kind of personal expression, like you might see in like yard art. The people who do that often have jobs as welders, so you'll see a lot of that steel art in areas that have steel plants around them, because people know how to do the thing as part of their labor, and now they apply it as part of their expressive culture within their leisure frame. Similarly with digital art, you have people who can do this for a living and do this for a living and also produce it artistically. So that it's fair to suggest the distinction between the stuff that one does for a living and the stuff that one does for fun, but the skill set are one and the same, because we're not dichotomizing folk and professional as absolutely as we can. But what happens when we have these things? One of the earliest examples, one of the very earliest examples of the issue of digital folklore is are the photoshops, and particularly what was the name? Backpack Man. Backpack was the I can't remember if that's sort of the official name that got associated with it. But there was a picture that came out soon after the attacks on September 11th, and it's a guy standing at the top of the World Trade Center, and he's got glasses, sunglasses on, his backpack, and sort of a little hat, and he's clearly like a tourist guy. Was it tourist guy? Maybe it's tourist guy. And you see a plane just about to hit, and that went out as the question is, did it go out as a hoax or not? Because when it went out, people were like, "Oh my god!" Because it had a caption associated with it, like a camera found at the base of at the base of Ground Zero, and this is the last photo that was taken on that camera, and you're like, "Oh my god, what's going on there?" And then clearly, well, not clearly, but people who could figure these things out better than I could quickly established how that was a hoax in terms of the position of the sun, in terms of the direction of the plane, in terms of a whole host of different things that are clearly, oh, okay, well, this is a Photoshop. And then that, it was a good enough Photoshop to inspire people. And clearly it's like not professional, but professional quality work. And then lo and behold, it became something that can then be parodied. And so it enters into this world. But you wouldn't have Photoshop lore if you prior to the age of Photoshop and prior to the age of the internet. First, you didn't have that material. Photo hoaxes were much more incredibly complicated to do. You can think about the Cottingley fairies and so on. But there was a much more difficult prospect. And second, it wouldn't have had that broad dissemination of like instantly taking a photo and being able to introduce it into a section into some kind of context where it gets shared and shared and shared and shared and shared and takes on, and then other people with the same skill set being able to be inspired by that and then duplicate it in fun ways once it's recognized that this is actually parody, once it's recognized that this is sort of a piece of art as opposed to a piece of reportage, and then it enters into that kind of thing. But we don't have the facility. We didn't have the facility to really talk about that. It took a long time for digital folklore to be recognized as a field. And now I think in part because an older generation of folklorists have moved online and participate almost by accident in these, and the young generation of folklorists who always were digital natives, that they've never that they are at ease on they are as at ease online as they are in real life, and arguably in some ways more so. It's like, of course, this is what we do once you introduce the concept to them. And so the documentation, the language is adjusting and changing, and much work now is being done on internet communities. Doubly so because as folklore sort of intersects with emerging contexts, we have to talk about things like anti-vaccination movements that really thrive online. We have to talk about things like conspiracy theories, which really thrive online. So it's not that these didn't have precedent, but digital, because you didn't have that idea of people being co-present to each other. Because once you eliminate the idea of people having to be co-present to each other in order to have sort of rich networks, you say, oh, okay, these people find themselves online and are able to sort of create. So folklorists really like talking about the artistic communication stuff because it's more pleasant. But we also want to talk about the rhetoric and the language that exists there, and how non-marked forms exist. So it's one thing for the creation of memes, and it's another thing for screeds. But we need to pay attention to the screeds as much, and like the forms of rhetoric and talk that are unmarked and yet are clearly articulating some kind of worldview and using metaphor and using shared deets and so on. As much as we want to look at the fun stuff like memes. Memes, fun stuff. Can still be biting, can still, of course, be used for ill as much as they are used for either not necessarily good, but simply for joy, jollity. But again, a form that doesn't have a specific precedent in a pre-internet culture, and yet we see that it functions in much the same way. That it is it's a unprecedented form that still has a kind of purpose in terms of communicating the esoteric understanding, taking some kind of stance, using the cultural reference that are available to one, and expressing within it. So there you go. So digital folklore is, as I said, it's one of the most vital areas to discuss, because even if we don't want to, we are affected by our online communities. And sometimes we are quite happy with them. I'm happy with mine. And sometimes we are, even those who do not participate at all in online communities, are like, well, we're seeing that much of the culture is now living there, and we should at least come to understand it. So, the question of the week is basically a variation on this particular theme. I'm presuming that there are online communities that you are part of, not necessarily named, but friendship groups and so on. And certainly you probably have some kind of social network. Maybe you're not a grandfather like I am. I'm not a grandfather. I just feel like I am. And so being on like Facebook still, maybe you have something else. But what are the forms? What are the artistic expressions, the creative expressions that your internet communities sometimes engage in? What are like unique things? And because, hey, this is question of the week, but we're also on Moodle, which is its own virtual space. If you got a fun meme, you could just like bring it in and you cut and paste it in. I think Moodle will allow for that. It might be a little bit of fiddling, but yeah, I mean, this is a meme that you might not understand if you weren't in my community, but trust me, it's hilarious. So anyway, that's it. Digital folklore. It is. You can do it conservatively in some ways, because the things that are expressed are still, nevertheless, similar to the things that are expressed in real life and in historically precedented one. On one hand, it's incredibly rich in terms of talking about internet culture and how these things form and how we do not use the same, we cannot merely extrapolate our old methodology of folklore onto digital culture. That being said, once we establish what we can't do, it's remarkable what we can do, because people are still reaching from the same basic pile of reference and still sort of understand the world in a way that is not much different from offline. And so, yeah, that's all I have to say. All right, then. I will be well, and I will talk to y'all later. Digital folklore. Hooray! Bye-bye.